David Bowie, the music and the legacy. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Behzad Bolour, and in this program I'll be considering the legacy of the singer David Bowie. On the news of his death, his fans gathered in Brixton in South London, where he was born, to pay tribute.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You really made the grade.
People respect him here, you know, he's a working boy, done good. No, he only lived here for 6 years, but I think he came back and apparently he got involved in some community projects here as well.
I think what he gave me at a very young age, I've always been an outsider, and what he gave us was it was okay to be different, that it was okay to be weird, that it was okay to be gay, to be bi, and he gave people strength that to be different is not a bad thing. I don't think punk would have happened in the way it did. I don't think there'd be a Madonna. He gave so much to so many people.
In all the words devoted to the death of David Bowie, no one has said he was one of the world's great singers. And not all of his work won popular acclaim, but his artistic ambition seemed to connect him to an impressively wide range of people. Hip-hop's Kanye West said Bowie was one of the most important musicians to have inspired his work. And when the news came, the Vatican's chief spokesman, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, tweeted the lyrics to one of his songs.
Check ignition and may God's love be with you.
Even a real astronaut tweeted from outer space as the UK's Tim Peake paid tribute from the International Space Station.
This is ground control to Major Tom.
I want to have a pause and talk about David Bowie in my life. I'm born in Iran and only moved to London when I was 18, so I knew Bowie before I moved here. My older brother had records from Britain and US, you know, what we call foreign music in Iran. And one of them was David Bowie's album. And I remember it looked such a strange man. It looked like a genie from a lamp, a non-sexual person. I couldn't figure out if he was a man or a woman, but I almost was certain that he was from outer space. But who was David Bowie? Or is it Bowie? The man himself wasn't sure.
Do you think of yourself as Bowie or David Jones, the boy from South London?
Less and less as Bowie.
How are we
I don't even know
pronounce
how
it?
to pronounce it anymore. I've lost track.
More importantly, what was the real impact of his music on the world? The Bowie story began in Brixton on 8th of January 1947. He was named David Robert Jones. At college in South London, he played in various bands with his lifelong friend George Underwood.
David and I discovered people like John Lee Hooker and Muddy Waters, and suddenly we wanted to be like them, you know. We were the wrong colour, you know, and we didn't come from particularly poor backgrounds, but you've got this sort of 15, 16-year-old kids singing about my woman left me and all this, and it probably sounded a bit weird, but we were trying very hard. College days were sort of interspersed with doing gigs and things, but no, I wouldn't have swapped it for the world. It was a great time.
It was in 1966 that he went into the studio to record his first album. Gus Tudgeon was the engineer on the session.
Normally, you had to have a hit record or some kind of success happening before you even got near getting the opportunity to make an album. And yet he came in and made an album. So I guess that they must have talked it through and said, you know, this guy's pretty wacky, but let's give him a shot. He was good fun to work with. He came in with really bizarre lineups, sort of, for a pop singer anyway. You'd have things like a string bass, an acoustic guitar, an oboe, and somebody hitting a bass drum or something. He had very unusual way of approaching his recordings. I mean, he did that Gravedigger thing, which is basically a monologue. I mean, who else goes around recording monologues?
The strange song that Gus is referring to is called Please, Mr. Gravedigger, extremely experimental for what was his debut album.
Yes, Mr. GD, you see me every day. Standing in the same spot by a certain grave. Mary Ann was only 10, full of life and oh so gay, and I was the wicked man who took her life away. Look at our girl.
I seem to remember He wanted some atmosphere, which is quite understandable. So I seem to remember I actually got the sound effects of the thunder and one or two other things out of the Decca. We had a huge sound effects library. I think there's some rain and some thunder and stuff. I haven't played it for so long, I can't remember. And he did actually stand in a box of gravel and did a very good sneeze. And he just shuffled around in this box of gravel while doing it, so that wasn't sort of put on afterwards. And I think he was just reacting to it as it happened.
Bowie was interested in the avant-garde, the cutting edge of art, not just music but also theatre, acting, cinema. In the late 60s, he met Tony Visconti, an American record producer and musician who shared his passion for the underground and alternative art scene.
Well, I think we struck each other as being free thinkers, and we wanted to break the boundaries of current pop music. He spoke about American groups like the Fugs and the Velvet Underground, who even most Americans hadn't heard of yet.
If I can, 'cause it makes me feel like I'm a man.
And I found it very exciting that I met a British person who had these similar tastes, and he wanted to do something similar in England.
Tony Visconti and Bowie started work on the next album, Space Oddity. Its title track was about a space mission gone wrong. Bowie was 22 years old when he played it for Mary Finnegan, who offered him a place to stay. She spoke to the BBC's Justin Webb following his death this week.
He was friends with the people who lived in the top floor flat above me, and I heard him playing one day and asked him to come down and have a cup of tea with me. And we talked long into the night. We became very good friends very quickly. And by the end of that evening, I said, I've got a spare bedroom. Would you like to move in? And he said, yes, please.
And you became lovers as well?
Yes. Yes, we did. It was never a conventional lodger-landlady relationship from the start.
Was he as electrifying one-to-one as he seemed often on stage?
I'm pretty devastated at the moment, so I may not be totally coherent about what I say, but I think the impression that you get of him always is that he knows where he's going and he knows what he wants to do. But he was very kind and helpful and loving towards me and my children during the time that he lived with us.
Did you keep in contact with him?
No, I last saw him in 1973 after a Ziggy Stardust concert when he threw a party for everybody in Beckenham. And I think at that stage he was going to move on from that sort of suburban milieu where he wrote some of his most engaging music while he was living with me. We ran a folk club together, we ran an arts lab, and we put on a free festival, all within the space of 9 months. It was incredibly high-energy stuff, and I rode that for the time that it was happening. And then after that, life changed.
Space Oddity was very different from his debut, a mix of rock and folk influences. Gus Sturgeon again.
When the demo was played by Bowie to Visconti, he just didn't like the song, apparently. He hated it. And our offices were virtually, they were like, 15, 20 feet away from each other. And they were having this meeting. And Bowie said to Visconti, this is the song that got me the deal. That's why it has to be recorded. And Visconti just apparently thought it sounded like a second-hand Simon and Garfunkel song and didn't like it at all. And he just said, well, you know Gus, don't you? And he said, yeah, what Gus does? And he said, yeah, well, he's just down the corridor in another office. Why don't you go and see him, play it to him? So he came in and we sat down, had a cup of tea, and he played me the demo, and it just blew me away. I couldn't believe that Tony didn't want to do it. So I rang him up on the phone and I said, are you sure you don't want to do it? He said, yeah, you want to do it. I said, yeah, sure. He said, well, you do the A-side and the B-side and I'll do the rest of the album. And that was how it came about. Simple as that.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Inspired by Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey, Bowie's label wanted the record's release date to coincide with the American lunar landing.
Take your protein pills and put your helmet on.
The singer featured musician Rick Wakeman, who remembers Bowie's innovative approach.
Those were the days when the rhythm section all played together. And we all played together, and David came down and he sang the song. And he'd also got a stylophone that he'd picked up in a shop on the way up. I think Rolf Harris was doing some sort of promotion. And he'd picked this thing up and he said, I'm going to get this on somewhere, which he did. It was the Gliss in the Middle. And I can say on a few occasions, out of all the 2,000-odd sessions and things that I did, there's sometimes you do a session, and it's very, very rare, where the hair on the back of your neck goes up and you think, oh, crikey, this is something special. I just felt very honoured to be part of it and couldn't wait for it to come out. But I also remember an argument in the control room, and David was insistent that it was produced, mixed and pressed as a stereo single. To the best of my knowledge, nobody released stereo singles at that time. And they pointed that out to David. Nobody releases a stereo single. All the singles are mono. And I can remember David saying, that's why this one will be stereo. And he just stood his ground. Every other session I'd done up to then, the producers and the record company were in total control of the artist. You'll do this, you will do this, and you played accordingly. Here was a man who wasn't being awkward, but he had a vision of how things should be.
This was Bowie's first hit single, reaching number 5 in the British charts. In his lifetime, David Bowie would produce a total of 27 studio albums, 9 live albums, and there were another 46 compilation albums. But at the start of 1970, he was working on his third, The Man Who Sold the World. David Bowie spoke about that time when he was interviewed for the BBC about it.
I was living in this huge, almost neo-Gothic pile down in Beckenham called Haddon Hall, which had some kind of baronial hall, entrance hall type thing. And the band that we collected together, Visconti and I, Mick Ronson, was it John Cambridge on drums? Tony on bass himself, of course, and his girlfriend Liz, everybody else's girlfriends, and me, and at the time Angela. So it kind of a commune thing, I suppose. Under the stairwell, Tony and Mick Ronson decided they would build a studio. And we wrote the original stuff for the man in that little room under the stairs.
Tony Visconti.
I love that album. I was a member of the band in that album as well as the producer. We were definitely 4 people, that includes Mick Ronson and Woody Woodmansey, who were really going against everything that was current at the time. Mick Ronson was into Cream, and he wanted me to play bass like Jack Bruce, and he was doing his best Clapton imitation on guitar, although sounding very original. The songs were coming out of strange places. I mean, David would come up with lyrics that definitely were not love songs. It wasn't glam rock. It was unusual music, and perhaps we needed somebody to really produce us, because if anybody in the group wanted to do something strange, I said, yeah, go ahead, do it, you know. And in the end, that's what the album came out. Actually, it spawned many schools of music. I mean, nowadays, even, you know, Nirvana recorded The Man Who Sold the World, and there are many groups who have been influenced by that album. It's almost a textbook in how to make an alternative album. It took years for the rest of the world to catch up with us.
It was great going there for the first time, because I had such American mania when I was a kid. So much of the literature and the music and everything, even the clothes at some point, before I became a mod. I think you can feel a general excitement about my work again. I mean, I got out of the despondency phase briefly. The whole Hunky Dory album reflected my newfound enthusiasm for this new continent that, you know, had been sort of opened up to me. And also I was listening to the music of a lot more Americans that were really not mainstream. People like Biff Rose is reflected a lot in the style of songwriting. I think one of the important things that happened with this is that I realized for the first time how essential environment is for writing. It all came together because I'd been to the States, and I think from that point onwards it started to become very important that I found environments and towns and cities that really started something up, because I realized that I just assimilate things, that wherever I am I'll be that city for the time that I'm there and for a few months afterwards. And so it kind of pointed to another way that I'd continue working. And that was the first time that a real outside situation had affected me so 100% that it changed my way of writing and changed the way that I looked at things.
Rick Wakeman worked with Bowie again on Hunky Dory.
I can remember to this day being in this big room with a grand piano. David opened the case and took out this battered old 12-string. The first piece he played me, he said, this is called Life on Mars. And he played it through. Now, at that time, most albums, if you were lucky, contained a winning track. He played it, and I thought, that's the winning track. That's just fantastic. And he said, this is Changes. And this just went on and on. I thought, this is just quite incredible. And he'd put the band to working on these tracks, and then the sessions were booked for a week at Trident Studios. So I can remember arriving for the sessions, quite excited. I can't honestly remember what the first track was, but when we started playing it, it was pretty obvious that the band actually didn't know it, or not as well as they should do, and it kept breaking down. And it came to about lunchtime. David gave a speech. He didn't shout or anything, but he said to these guys, "You've had X amount of time to learn these songs." He said, "You've had good rehearsal facilities, being paid, this is a wonderful opportunity, and you haven't learned them." He said, "You can pack your stuff up, go and practice them, and we'll come back in the studio when you've learned them." And I'm sitting there going, "Oh, I don't want to be here." And he just said, "If you want to go back and be a small band up in Hull or whatever it is, that's what you want to do, that's fine." And when we came back in to do the album, I can't remember whether it was a week, 2 weeks, or whenever it was, the band were hot. They were so good, and the tracks just flowed through. There were a lot of very early takes, which is why it just all feels so good.
Tactful cactus by a window surveys the prairie of your room.
I quite honestly will not hear a bad word said about the man. I learnt so much from him as regards recording, as regards the music industry, as regards how to treat people, as regards how to stand up to yourself, but also be prepared to listen. If you could say that I had a manual that has helped me tremendously through my 30 years in the business, David probably would have written 3/4 of it.
But Tony Visconti did not work with Bowie this time.
I think the stress was mainly, I don't know how to put this delicately, but kind of girlfriend problems. Like, I had a girlfriend I was living with called Liz, and of course he had just married Angie, who became Angie Bowie, obviously. And we were having like internal stress in the flat, like how much money we should spend on the weekly groceries and all that. And whether you like it or not, that stuff kind of creeps into the recording too. And of course, ultimately made a them and us situation where Angie and David would avoid us. So sometimes we'd only meet in the studio, and I'd find out that David wasn't very prepared, like he'd have no lyrics. We were getting closer and closer to the mixing stage. And in fact, the last day of the mixing session, he finally sang The Man Who Sold the World, and I had like 5 hours left of studio time because the record company was clamoring for a product, and we had already spent too much money. So I think it was a combination of all the domestic squabbles, and they were like on their honeymoon during this album. It was very hard to get David and Angie separated so I could get him into the studio to work. And in the end, I kind of got disgusted, and I finished the album, but I kind of walked away from it because it was just too chaotic for me to be involved in.
David Bowie and his first wife Angie were married for 10 years. When she was told about his death, she said that they had not spoken for almost 40 years. They had one son, Zowie Bowie, now known as Duncan Jones.
Will you stay in a lover's story?
This song, Cooks, from the Hunky Dory album, was written about parenthood and being different. He performed it in this BBC session, soon after Zowie was born.
With a couple of cooks hung up on romancing.
Other well-known tracks on this album include Changes, Oh Pretty Things, and Life on Mars.
Take a look at the long man beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, wonder if you'll ever know who's in the best-selling show. Is there life on Mars?
But there was one that was not very well received. A homage to the artist Andy Warhol.
Andy Warhol looks a scream. Hang him on my wall. Andy Warhol, silver screen. Can't tell them apart at all.
He hated it. He loathed it. He told people afterwards, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. I was really, I was upset by that. I thought it was kind of a flattering portrait of him. I thought it was a very contemporary picture of Andy at the time. But God knows what he would have thought of me actually playing him in a film all those years later. We never particularly got on. I've seen him around a lot. You couldn't avoid Andy. In the 70s and 80s, he'd literally attend the opening of an envelope. So everywhere you went, he was always there with his camera and being on the scene. So I got to study him from afar a lot. And you couldn't really have a conversation with him. He was very withdrawn, incredibly shy, and very nervous in public situations.
The cover for Hunky Dory 2 showed David Bowie looking feminine. In 1972, he told the music magazine that he was gay, although he was actually bisexual.
Well, I had thought of saying I was an existentialist, but I'd realised that had been used. I was into long hair, adopting what I presumed was kind of an Evelyn Waugh Oxbridge look. I'd gone from pre-Raphaelite to Evelyn Waugh. The photograph on the front, I guess the idea was to capture that rather camp iconographic 40s thing, male or female, didn't really matter.
Bowie was an inspiration for others who were finding their sexuality at this time. People like the international pop icon Boy George and first Tom Robinson, who had a UK hit with the song Glad to Be Gay in the 70s.
I couldn't possibly have done that if it hadn't been for David Bowie before. Bowie and his music made such an impact on me in my early 20s in 72 in terms of changing my life, seeing that I had choices, it was possible to have a happy life if you were attracted to the same sex.
First time I saw Bowie singing live was on the old Grey Whistle Test. He was doing Starman and 3 or 4 other songs. I'd never actually seen him in real life before, so it was quite a seminal moment in my youth. I was about, I think, probably 12. And I can remember my grandmother kind of screaming in horror and saying, "Who the hell is that big puff?" And I was just totally transfixed. I mean, you know, it was so exciting to actually see this guy, you know, with shaved eyebrows and a spooky hairdo and interesting clothes. That was a fabulous moment for me.
You're listening to a special program about the British singer David Bowie, who has died following an 18-month battle with cancer. It was a shock to many. The British Prime Minister David Cameron paid this tribute to him.
Genius is an overused word, but I think musically, creatively, artistically, David Bowie was a genius. For someone of my age, he provided a lot of the soundtrack of our lives, from the first time I heard Space Oddity to watching our athletes appear in those wonderful Olympics to the strains of Heroes. He was a master of reinvention, and one of the things that's so incredible is almost all his reinventions were incredible successes and worked brilliantly. So we mourn the loss of a great talent who has enriched all of our lives.
This song to me has such an energy, you know. Many mornings when I walk from my home to BBC and it's just gloomy day, I listen to this song and it lifts me up. Especially when it says, "We could be heroes just for one day." And I've translated it to Persian and say it many times in my programs and to people I see. I use his line in Persian. ما میتونیم قهرمان باشیم حتی شده یک روز. We could be heroes just for one day.
We could be heroes just for one day.
Bowie has become known as the master of reinvention. He continued to reinvent himself and his music after he killed off the character of Ziggy Stardust. He was being influenced by his experiences in the United States and was working with jazz musician pianist Mike Garson.
I was, in hysterics. I mean, I thought it was just... I would go back to my jazz buddies and say, "You can't believe what I'm doing." Now I'm kind of used to it, but I thought it was just beyond words. But there was a part of me that knew that this was a creative individual. I didn't think it was just this gig with this rock guy. I knew that he had something special. So I never felt I was lowering myself to play rock and roll, so to speak, from where I was coming from jazz and classical, because when I work with him, I never feel degraded. So for me, it doesn't matter if an artist is jazz, classical, pop, rock, or folk. If they have that special magic, which at the level he has it, there's maybe only 5 or 10 in any given generation. And he's one of them. There's no question about it.
Bowie moved to Los Angeles, and his lifestyle increasingly involved harder drugs.
Your work is governed by the way that you live. There's absolutely no doubt of that. The ingredients, I really set myself up. It was all there within me anyway. Short attention span, a liking for more avant-garde ways of reading and looking at things. And it just sort of came together as go down this dark avenue. And that's sort of the route that I chose, with negative and positive results.
Wow!
The positive effect of this period was his work with soul musicians like Carlos Alomar, who had worked with James Brown.
I knew that I would not.
My approach to David was just like my approach to anybody else, very cordial but real. And I think that is what made it easy for him to talk to me, where I'll tell him, hey, man, you really look like crap. You're so thin. What's up with that, Look, if you want to get fattened up, come to my house in Queens and, my wife will make you a nice meal. I'm not sure if he had that kind of approach by other people. When his limousine rolled up in Queens to where I used to live, I was somewhat shocked, I love that about David. He's an extremely curious person, and that curiosity, I think, has been with him from the very beginning all the way to the very end.
Also in these sessions with Carlos was a backing singer called Luther Vandross, who would later become a huge star in his own right.
Bowie asked me if I'd mind going on and singing 5 or 6 of my songs, so I said sure. Well, a lot of what would happen was we'd keep hearing Bowie, Bowie, David, Bowie. So we came off stage, and the first night I said, David, oh, I can't do that again. I said, they're waiting for you. They don't want to hear what it is that I'm offering. And he says, you can't pay attention to that. You can't, the lesson in it was that you have to do your own art for its own sake. I took that and we went out, and the audiences, as the tour went on, really warmed up, surprisingly enough. And so that was a major lesson that he taught me.
She was a young American. Young American, young American. She was the young American. All night. But she was the young American.
Bowie's soul venture led to his appearance on America's black music show, Soul Train, one of the few white artists who had ever been invited on, but his cocaine use was getting out of control, as he later recalled.
I do remember not knowing the words. I wasn't even buoyant enough to feel apologetic. I hadn't bothered to learn it. And the MC of the show, who was a really charming guy, took me on one side after the third or fourth take where I just had no idea what the lyrics were. He said, there are kids lined up to do this show who have fought their whole lives to try and get a record and come on here, and it made I know now, looking back, at the time it made no impression. His little speech to me, which was absolutely necessary. And I just screwed up the lyrics. I haven't even seen the show for years, so I can't even remember if it looked like I screwed it up. But I think maybe I wrote them out in the end and read them off a card.
Don't let me hear you say life's taking you nowhere.
To clean himself up, Bowie headed back to Europe with friend and US singer Iggy Pop. They went to Berlin, where Bowie worked with Brian Eno, producing this more electronic sound. Their collaboration produced 3 albums, which became known as the Berlin Trilogy.
I see it written time and time again that one of the great influences on the albums that we did there is Kraftwerk. But you know what? We are the antithesis of what Kraftwerk were doing. Kraftwerk were working in a very robotic, minimalist fashion. There was no live drum kit. They were using electronic drum kit. And they kept away from the idea of blues form or R&B form completely. It has a very European sensibility and almost 19th century structure to the music. Whereas I was using a very funky band with live musicians, live real-time tempo, and swathing it with atmospheric sounds over the top with myself and Visconti and Eno. But it was their provocation, the fact that they were working in a new area. The area itself became something that captivated me.
Carlos Alomar recalls how Bowie wanted to try out new creative techniques, like acting out emotions to play notes, which he didn't think would work.
Hell no. I thought, again, that's that curiosity thing. I know you want to find out where this is going to go, and I'm sure that out of 100 ideas, one of them is going to work, but why? I mean, here we got a great thing going on. We've had great albums, great reviews, everything. Well, why do I have to do this? I mean, I thought it for a second, but respecting his curiosity and his innovativeness, I said, well, let me try this. Maybe something will come of it. And I'll tell you one thing. It was the best of all that I've ever done with David Bowie. I love the trilogy more than anything else. Finally, I get the album at home, and I hadn't heard anything. Because I have to wait for the album just like everybody else. And I put this album on, and I turned off all the lights, and I put on my headphones and later played it to the big speakers. I was in love. I mean, I love that stuff. That's why I'm one of the biggest David Bowie fans.
David was hardly drinking and certainly not using drugs at that time. I mean, I heard contrary to that after I left, but certainly not at that time. And he was actually at his most vulnerable self that I've ever encountered him to be. We were just going out and having like polite little meals. We made some excursions across the Checkpoint Charlie into East Berlin, but it was a very normal period of his life. And I gave both him and Iggy haircuts. They wanted short German haircuts so they could really fit in with the rest of the people. It was very funny. These guys look like anyone else on the street. And actually, when we went through Checkpoint Charlie, the Red Guards looked at all our passports, and there was David's Space Oddity picture in there with his perm. And Iggy had his bleach blonde hair with his fringe, and the pictures did not line up with the two gentlemen that were presenting the passports. And the Red German guards were like laughing. They would say, "Hey, Fritz, come over here, look at this." And they were like laughing at the two of them. So, yeah, they really changed their appearance. And I remember the checkered shirts and the checkered hat. And David had a little blonde mustache. And he looked like your average German, actually.
Tony Visconti, who wrote after hearing of Bowie's death, he always did what he wanted to do. And he wanted to do it his way. And he wanted to do it the best way. By the time the 1980s arrived, Bowie finalized a bitter divorce with Angie and won custody of their son. The 80s also brought hit songs and commercial success.
I just walked into a nightclub about 5 a.m. and so I just started chatting with him, and for some reason we instantaneously hooked up because our conversation went from friends we knew to jazz musicians that we idolized.
US producer and musician Nile Rodgers.
We became partners, so it was a sort of symbiotic relationship. And then he said to me that he wanted me to do what I did best. What do you think I do best? And he said in no uncertain terms, you make hits. I want you to make a hit. So this is how David made me clear as to what the record should sound like. He came to my apartment one day and he was holding something sort of behind his back. And he says, "No, darling, I want my record to sound like this." And it was a picture of Little Richard in a red suit getting into a red Cadillac. And I knew what he meant. I knew that from the way that picture looked, that he wanted something that was evergreen, that would look like the future, even in the year 3050.
Put on your red shoes and dance the blues.
But that particular song, the Let's Dance song, created havoc in my life, I think, the way it sort of tended to make me... I allowed myself to be pushed into the commercial arena because I'd never been there, and it was sort of, ooh, what's it like? What's a limo like? Because, I hadn't really been, apart from the early days of Ziggy, I'd gotten out of that fast when I'd gotten away from Main Man, and the limo life thing was just not what I really wanted, But there it was on a gold plate, and I jumped into the back seat with my future in my hands.
It was a huge hit and brought Bowie worldwide fame. But this did not sit comfortably with him and led to a period of creative despondency. Nile Rodgers.
It wasn't that he couldn't come up with the next thing. It's just that I think that he, and this is just my guess, that he expected people wanted him to make another big hit, but he also wanted to do it his way. He did something completely different, and it didn't quite work commercially.
The trouble is I was getting away with it, you see. I mean, the albums were selling like hotcakes, and it's embarrassingly enough. Tonight Never Let Me Down were like huge sellers for me. It's like, oh. Listen to Station of Stars, listen to Scary Monsters, listen to Low, listen to anything but these two. Don't think these are indicative of what I do best. But they did sell. I needed a good slap. I still need a good slap every now and again, actually. My major failing was to opt out of the production process. I virtually left it to everybody else to do for me because I had so little interest in the process, and that's really bad. That's really bad. And it was by the time we got to Never Let Me Down that halfway through making that album I realised I've got no interest in making this album whatsoever. I'm just providing that dreadful word product. I'm just providing product for the record company. This has got to stop. It really has to stop. And so once we put the tour to bed, because that was an obligation to support the album, blah, 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 I said, that's it, I'm never doing this again. I can't do it. I just can't work like this. I'm more interested in reading books and going to museums now. I mean, that's terrible. It's like making music and performing is like my work with a capital W, and I never envisaged in my life that that's what it would become, even though it was enormously successful.
Okay, Tokyo, South America, Australia, France, Germany.
He put his celebrity to use on Live Aid, which raised millions for charity. Here's Bob Geldof in Against All Odds, a BBC documentary about the making of the event.
I genuinely didn't know that they were going to go off to a studio and do dancing in the street, which is, so apt. And then knocked off a video, which is hilarious. These two sort of queens trying to out-camp each other, really. And it went to number one, and the money came to us.
I was going to do my part of the song in England, and Jagger was going to be in the States doing his part over there. But we couldn't find anybody who was fully convinced that we could actually sing at the same time and make it work everywhere, so we abandoned that idea anyway.
Bowie fell in love with music again in his later work with Tin Machine, a group of Anglo-American musicians who came together to make the music they said they enjoyed listening to. With a hard rock, pre-grunge sound, the critics were scathing.
The critics are terribly conventional, and I think actually there's some great material on the two albums. The two Tin Machine albums have some of the best songs that I've written, actually, on them. As I say, I think the context annoyed and angered and really gave the critics the excuse they needed to humiliate somebody.
For Bowie, though, it marked the start of an artistic rejuvenation. Tim Palmer produced both of Tin Machine's albums and spoke to the BBC from Texas after Bowie's death.
I think he achieved more in one life than most people could do in about 5, There were so many transitions in the characters and the people that he became, and the Tin Machine sort of set a light under him again. He was an amazing singer, and I remember being in the studio. He was singing on a song called Amlapura, and it was a very sad sort of type song.
Make way for the Java, watching for boogie.
And he sung this vocal, and I listened to it, and I thought, in my opinion, it was great. And I said to David, are you happy with that? And he said no. And he told me that he felt it wasn't quite sad enough. And he went out, and he sung the vocal again, just slightly flat. to give a sort of melancholy, sadder vibe to this music. And I've never, in my 35 years as a record producer, seen a vocalist be able to re-sing a vocal perfectly, just slightly flatter.
Around this time, Bowie met and fell in love with the supermodel Iman Abdul-Majid, who was a major influence on his next piece of work.
I met her in Los Angeles. Our hairdresser, our mutual hairdresser, actually arranged a blind date. And boy, was he accurate that we would get on with each other. And it was smack right from the first night. That was it. It was over. It was incredible. And I really devised the music to kind of sort of pay my respects to the newfound situation which I'd been handed. I mean, that was really a personal album in that my life suddenly became rose-tinged. Everything became very special for me in those formative months of our relationship. It was sweet. It's a sweet album, that, isn't it?
They were married in 1992 and remained so until his death. In 2000, they had a baby girl called Alexandria, who Bowie was determined would have a normal upbringing. He took this opportunity to take a step back from the limelight. Imam posted a poignant message just before he died. Sometimes you will never know the true value of a moment until it becomes a memory. The award-winning poet Lavinia Greenlaw wrote a poem in tribute to David Bowie following his death.
I'm a girl who looks like a boy who looks like a girl, and everything is going to be all right. The one I will love when I'm old enough to love is waiting for me out there on the street among the puddles and cardboard boxes, wearing emerald lurex and a gold crest. His attributes, including his boyness, will be reversible, and I will learn that mine are too. One of these is that he has several voices. He sounds like loose straw, or a bowl of water overturning in a bowl of water, or a mountain king. He has the ability to detach himself from himself in order to reform. He will teach me to offer something to look at in order not to be seen, that in order to be heard, I must not repeat myself. He will always be leaving, walking backwards, and singing even after the door is closed. He is gone. Exiled to the flat fields, we can dance to this. We can perfect our routine.
Lavinia told the BBC that Bowie's lyrics often were like poetry.
I prefer to think of lyrics and poetry as separate things, and I think he wrote brilliant lyrics. But I think where they were so powerful particularly sort of back in the 70s, were their un-Englishness, their sort of absolute kind of agile elusiveness, his ease with being completely hyperbolic and dense. And I would sort of play things to my friends and be completely baffled when they broke into laughter. But I think he always knew when to pull back. So when he got to the heart of the song, he's using the simplest possible words. It's a sweet thing. All I see is all I know. Baby, I'll never let you go. All I see is all I know. And he was very artful in a way that was quite foreign and exciting to us and provocative. It's just like, he went very fast through the 70s. We had punk, and punk was kind of helium, but Bowie was the oxygen. And Bowie was there ahead of you and giving you something else to breathe, always, and always something different. And I think there's this combination in writing, as well as everything else he did, of conviction with the complete willingness to set himself aside and detach himself and move on.
In an ever-changing career, Bowie touched the lives of many to become one of the most influential musicians of his era. Back to fans mourning his loss in London. Can I talk to you because you're laying flowers for him? Can you explain who he was for someone who doesn't know about him at all?
No, you can't. That's the beautiful thing about him. He wasn't one thing. He was everything.
If you think about all the transformations he went through in his life, all the music he made, he was just absolutely astonishing. I don't think there's anyone that quite has that genius that he had.
The way that he challenges gender stereotypes and the way that he challenges just how people need to look or should look is so incredible. It's a really wild.
always weird, always one step ahead. I mean, it's with his new album as well, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
One step ahead, always.
And his last album, Black Star,
Yeah, well,
came
that's
out.
what I mean. You know, he made that album to say goodbye, and it's very moving.
We won't stop you. Please go and lay your flowers. Thank you.
In the villa of Amen. In the villa of Amen.
A final thought from the man himself, taken from an interview with the BBC's John Wilson in 2002, where he shares his feelings about getting older.
It's not the age itself, you know. I mean, age doesn't bother me. It's the lack of years left that weighs far heavier on me. I have a wonderful life. I'm so lucky to have found the right woman to share my life with. We have a child, and I do what I've always wanted to do. Yet it's having to let go of it all, you know. Even more so now, it's so much more poignant. There's such a, for me often, there's such a cloud of melancholia about knowing I'm going to have to leave my daughter on her own. It just doubles me up in kind of grief. It's the death part that's really a drag. You know, everything else I can quite cope with.
I'm Behzad Bolour. Thanks for listening to this podcast from the BBC World Service.